Crosspoint students, it is so great to be back with you. My name is Tanner, and for those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet, I'm the Next Gen worship pastor. It just means I get to design and organize the worship set list for each week, and every now and then I get the opportunity to meet with you in your small group. And this week we're continuing in week 3 of our series Afterlife. And let's just start this way. I want you to raise your hand if you've had a sibling in your space right now. For those of you who don't, just let me explain a little bit about sibling dynamics. One of the best parts about having a brother or sister is that you can blame them for stuff. Like, you can point at them when something breaks in the kitchen, or you can shovel your green beans off on their plate so that you can get dessert and they're stuck finishing your dinner. Brothers and sisters are the reason why we have phrases like, they did it first, or it wasn't my fault. That's why they were invented. So even if you don't have a sibling, you probably have someone in your life, your childhood, who you would put the blame on, something like a cousin or a classmate or friend. And if you haven't, you may have been that friend. So you put the blame on them for your mess ups. Our impulses as kids don't really change as adults. We remain pretty skilled at avoiding responsibility and putting the blame on someone else. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember the last time you felt guilty? Yeah, like maybe you copied a little too much of your friend's homework, or maybe you didn't tell your girlfriend the whole story of what happened at the party. Maybe you lingered a little too long on that website. Maybe you told your stepmom that you were going to one place, and you did, but with a different crowd than you told her you may be going there with. Or maybe you said you were studying the whole time, but you're really just binging on that new show on Netflix, had your textbook open the whole time. You know, there are all sorts of things to feel guilty about. And no matter how old we get, it just seems like our reaction is a lot like a 5-year-old. We hide, we stretch the truth, we make up excuses and try to cover it up altogether. When we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. And we have all sorts of hiding tricks. We avoid our small group leaders or the coaches in our lives. And we try not to make eye contact with a teacher. We ghost our friends. We play it cool around the people in charge, but we may even turn off our location services, hide our location. We do everything we can to act as though nothing happened, even though on the inside we know what we did was wrong and it's eating us up. This isn't just what we did with the other people. If we believe in God, chances are good that guilt causes us to hide from Him too. We know God knows what we did is wrong, so we back away from our relationship with Him. It's easy to hide something we did from the people around us, but it's much more difficult to hide it from God. We can't actually run away from Him, so we just start to make Him less and less a part of our lives. Maybe you still go to small group, but when the conversation gets real, you just disengage. Or maybe you still show up to church, but you're not really feeling it in the worship anymore, and you may just even not enjoy coming. Maybe you tell everyone that you just got too much going on with school or sports or whatever, but really, you just don't want to participate in this faith stuff anymore. No matter what it looks like for you, we all tend to let our guilt get in the way of our faith. Thankfully, I'm thankful for it. We're not the first people to have these kind of experiences of guilt. And the Bible gives us just plenty of examples, like a ton of examples of people who went through the same thing that we go through, and we can learn from them. And for the past few weeks, as a part of the Easter season, we've been in a series called Afterlife. We've looked at people who physically saw Jesus after the resurrection, after He came out of the grave. See, when you see a friend who died now walking around alive, it tends to change you. It changed me. I'm sure it would change you. For many people, their lives were radically different after they saw the resurrected Jesus. Their life after, or their afterlife, was dramatically changed. And that includes a guy named Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends, and he was a key leader during the early days of the Christian movement. But Peter had some run-ins with guilt and shame like we do sometimes. Peter was known as being Jesus' loud friend. We all have them. I know I'm the loud friend. I'm sure you have those. This got Peter into trouble from time to time. And the worst example of this happened when Jesus was sentenced to die on a cross. When Jesus was arrested, Peter literally cut off a guy's ear to defend Jesus. I don't think it's a recommended strategy to prove your loyalty to a friend, but I mean, at least he was there for Jesus. But then Jesus, hours later, He was given this sketchy, bogus trial, and Peter stood nearby and lied on 3 separate occasions about his connection with Jesus. He even denied knowing Jesus. Even worse, before any of this happened, Jesus told Peter that that was exactly what he would do, that he would deny being connected to Jesus. Jesus basically told Peter, I've experienced your loyalty so far, but when it comes down to the end, you won't be loyal to me. And then Peter defends himself, assuring Jesus that he would never do that. And then at Jesus' lowest moment, that's exactly what Peter did. Jesus was arrested, he was tried, he was nailed to a Roman cross. And the last thing Peter did was deny even knowing Jesus. I mean, I almost feel guilty for him right now. What a brutal end to his story, right? But like we've talked about in this series, Jesus' death wasn't the end of the story. Easter happens, the tomb is empty, and Jesus is alive. The whole direction of the story changes, which is awesome, unless you're Peter. He probably had some mixed feelings. I mean, I got to think he probably thought, I'm so glad Jesus is back, but does that mean I have to face him after what I did? To Peter, it's possible that the resurrection was a reminder of the guilt he felt. And if he felt guilt, sometimes I wonder if he ran through all of the same phases of guilt that we do. I wonder if he wanted to lie and exaggerate and defend himself and even hide from Jesus altogether. A few days later, Jesus was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter was on this boat with the other disciples, and he saw Jesus, and they went to the shore. Jesus made him breakfast, which I think is really cool. And then he brought up the thing that no doubt was weighing on Peter's mind. So if you guys want, open your Bibles to John chapter 21, starting in verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, second time, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And then a third time, Jesus looks at Peter. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Then it says Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. See, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus asked Peter, do you love me 3 times? In other words, for every time that Peter denied knowing Jesus, Jesus gives Peter another chance. And in giving him a chance, Peter knows he is loved and forgiven. Jesus wants Peter to know that he has a second chance. He even tells Peter that he wants him to continue to lead, which is why he said, feed my sheep. This exchange, I think, is so interesting because Jesus asks Peter if he still loves him. And as humiliating and terrible as it was for Peter to deny Jesus, here was a chance to make it right. And even though Peter may have given up on himself, Jesus hadn't given up on him. Peter could have given in to the guilt and gone into hiding, but that isn't what Jesus wanted for Peter. Jesus didn't want Peter's life to be defined by guilt. He wanted Peter to experience grace. And Peter knew Jesus had been killed. He saw Jesus after he'd come back to life. This proved to Peter that Jesus was capable of offering him the grace he needed to forgive himself. The resurrection showed Peter the power Jesus had. And Peter's encounter with Jesus on the beach showed that Jesus chose to offer him powerful grace. The resurrection proved that guilt didn't have to destroy Peter's faith. Instead, grace can destroy the guilt and fuel his faith. Because of grace, Peter was no longer controlled by his guilt. Because of grace, Peter accepted the love that Jesus offered him. And because of grace, Peter traveled around the world preaching about the same grace that changed his life. Think of it this way. Because of the resurrection, Peter knew he was forgiven. I don't know what's been causing you to feel guilt, but chances are that the entire time we've been discussing this topic tonight, you've had something on your mind. If you're ready for something new, I want to give you a couple steps that you can start taking right now. Step one is to get real about where you feel guilt. And this can be really tough, especially if you've hidden something so deep that you feel numb to it. But think about where you feel lingering guilt right now. Be honest with yourself about it. Acknowledge it. Maybe you want to journal about it or even take out your phone and open the notes app and write it down. Just get honest. Number two is to remember that guilt is no match for God's grace. Ask God to remind you that He is with you and for you, even in those days. Ask Him to cover your guilt with the overwhelming reality of His grace. Listen, Easter matters for a lot of reasons. It shows us how big God's love is, what exactly God is like, and how God is more powerful than anything, including death. But Easter also shows us that Jesus is bigger than our guilt. And if Jesus gives us grace, it's ours for the taking. So when you feel those old guilt feelings kicking in, ask God to give you a new reaction. And the final thing that you can do right now is you can keep showing up and speaking up. Do the opposite of what guilt may have guided you to do in the past. Instead of hiding, show up in your small groups text thread. Show up at church gatherings. Show up to hang out with your friends. Show up to meetups with your small group leaders. After the resurrection, Peter didn't hide from Jesus. It would have been easy to, but he didn't. Like Peter, let's keep showing up. The resurrection proved that our guilt is no match for God's grace. We don't have to let guilt change our faith anymore. Instead, we get to let grace change our guilt. We know that talking about God's grace is one thing, but experiencing it is something else entirely. And that's why we have small groups. We want you to have a safe space to fight for that grace when your guilt feels just too heavy. Small groups is the safest place for you to discover this alongside with your friends and your small group leaders. Your small group leaders have gone through training to handle some pretty tough conversations. And they themselves have got people in their lives that they can get real with about their guilt as well. They've encountered grace, and they'll pass that same grace on to you. Why? Because that's what the resurrected Jesus demonstrated in Peter's life. And that's why Peter's afterlife was so powerful while he was still alive on earth. Because of the resurrection, Peter realized that grace is greater than guilt. And because of Easter, you can realize it as well. So good to be with you guys. Have a great discussion in small groups. I'll see you next time.